Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Wednesday, July 24th, 2013, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. Today's interview for the Center on the American Governor is with Brenda Bacon, who served as Chief of Management and Planning from 1990 to 1994 in the administration of Governor Jim Florio. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you, Rick.
You got your introduction into the Florio administration somewhat differently from the way most other folks end up getting involved. You were not involved in politics and government coming into the administration, and not just the Florio administration, but most other administrations in Trenton. Most of the people who end up being attracted are people who have a background in government and politics. You don't. Let's talk a little bit about your formative years. Where did you grow up? What did you want to be when you grew up? And how did you end up coming into government at that time?
Wow, let's see. I grew up in Southeast Washington, D.C. And I went to school, for the most part, I went to a Catholic neighborhood school and then to an all-girls high school in Bladensburg, Maryland, and then went to Hampton University for my undergrad. My undergraduate degree is in social work, and so I wanted to change the world. And absolutely, as everybody who graduated from college in the late 60s, or early 70s wanted to change the world. I really believed I could do that. My husband, who I met in college, was from Philadelphia. So we really settled in South Jersey, but in the Philadelphia area. And I decided I was going to work for the probation board. Which absolutely sent him and his family in a tizzy, saying, no, you're not going to work for the probation board. So I said, okay, well, I found something else, and I became a social worker, an intake social worker with the welfare board in Philadelphia. And my view of doing that job was that every time someone came in, I had before then reviewed the classified ads, back in the day when the jobs were actually advertised in the paper. And I would circle the jobs that were available for the person who was coming in to apply for welfare, because I naively assumed that it's just simply for lack of a job and someone helping you find the job that you would be here to be on welfare. So after doing that for a while, where people just kind of looked at me like, I just arrived from Mars or something, like, I don't want a job, I want my own check, which would be what people would say, second or third generation people on welfare. Unfortunately, having never seen anyone get up and go to work every day, having not experienced believing that they could do something magnificent with their lives, the goal became, if you had your own child, you became what they called an emancipated minor at 16, which I found incredibly sad. And, so I started to think about, it's really not social work that I wanted to do, which is kind of one-on-one work with people, but changing things, changing education and healthcare and other things that would make lives different from a macro perspective. So I took a position with the what was called the Health and Welfare Council in Camden, and they were a United Way agency, and they were charged with working with other groups and with government to make change in healthcare and education and all kinds of policy things. And
when is this?
That was 1974, I think I took that position. Okay, so I'm 2 years out of college at this point, out of undergrad school. That's when I first met Jim Florio. He had just, been elected to Congress. So he was a freshman congressman. I became a member of the board of what was called the Health Systems Agency, which was a regional planning body for healthcare under the National Health Planning Act. And so all over the country you had these things. There were 4 or 5 of them in New Jersey. And it was made up of healthcare professionals like the CEOs of the hospitals, and doctors, and then consumers, what they call consumers. And I was one of the consumer representatives representing the Health and Health Planning Agency. So the congressman and I would often be in the same place talking about healthcare policy or things like that, whether it was a Rotary Club dinner or some kind of an event. And we became good friends just about issues about healthcare. And so that led to, I remember one meeting in particular where the CEO of one of the hospitals and I got into a heated debate about access to health care. And he said to me, "You've never met a payroll, you don't know what you're talking about." And that resonated with me a little bit. And I decided at that point I was going to go back to graduate school. And instead, I was the third of a way to getting my MSW, but I decided now I'm going to go to graduate school and get my MBA. And I went to, I said to my husband, I said, I can go to Temple, or I can go to the school called Wharton, because I didn't know anything about the business world at the time. And so he jokingly said, well, why don't you go to Wharton, you know? And so I applied and got in, and spent the next 2 years, a very difficult, challenging 2 years, but got my MBA in healthcare management. Full-time, I went full-time.
So you left your job?
I left my job and went full-time. And so when I came out, went to work for a hospital, still on the Health Systems Agency. But in 1981, as you remember, the governor ran for governor. Jim Florio ran for governor. And at that point, I was involved only on a policy kind of level. You know, like he might call me, or I would see him somewhere and he'd say, what do you think about this or that, or health planning?
Let's go back a little. After you left the Health Systems Agency, and so you no longer had this direct regular dealing with the congressman for at least a couple of years when you were in Wharton, how did you and he get back together again from what this must be 77, 78 or so? When
well, I was still with the Health Systems Agency because I was chair of the board by that time.
This was a voluntary.
It was voluntary. I never worked for the Health Systems Agency.
I see.
It was a voluntary position.
So you were still the consumer representative on this even while you were in graduate school.
Yes.
I see.
Yes. Okay. And there were several things that we did during that time that became very noteworthy. At that time, both Our Lady of Lourdes and Cooper Medical Center wanted to be named as the regional tertiary perinatal center, and that was a big battle. So there was a lot of press, there were a lot of public officials that would weigh in, you know, on issues like that. So I kept in touch with Jim, and when he ran in '81, while I did not work on the campaign, actually the last 6 weeks of the campaign, I took a leave of absence from Pennsylvania Hospital, where I was on the management staff, and went to help the campaign on policy issues.
Okay, and what did that mean, helping the campaign on policy issues? Now, did you meet with the candidate on a daily basis? Were you involved in political strategy, in formulating, the last 6 weeks, by that time it was already fairly apparent that he was going to win.
Well, in '81, no, he lost in '81.
I'm sorry, we're in '81.
This was '81.
Oh, we're way ahead of our time.
Oh, yeah,
okay.
We're way ahead.
Oh, yeah, all right.
No, 6 weeks out, it was pretty close.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
It was a tight race.
I'm sorry.
And you know, he asked me to come and help, and I thought I could help. I like to look at challenges, to accept challenges. You know, I like to organize things. I'm very policy driven. Those, you know, as you well know. So I was very, and he's always been very interested in healthcare and healthcare policy. So yes, I saw him quite a bit. I was in the South Jersey office for those last very intense 6 weeks of the '81 campaign.
This is your introduction to politics.
Yes. Yes.
Did you like it?
No, I didn't like losing. I didn't particularly like politics. So it probably, you know, when I see someone like Jim Florio with that kind of conviction and that kind of work ethic, and someone I had come to know, you know, through just the policy part of things for many years, I wanted him to win. I thought he'd make a good governor. So after that, I went, you know, back to Pennsylvania Hospital.
And he went back to Washington.
And he went back to Washington. And then they approached me in 1982 to become a freeholder in Camden County, to take Wayne Bryant's. Wayne had just been elected to the Assembly. And so they approached me from this way. They said, would you just come and hold down the seat until the next election, because, there are a lot of people that are interested in the seat, but if you'll just, take this unexpired term, because that was an appointment at that time. So there were only about, there weren't many months left, because I think in 83 there was an election. But, so I did that. I became a freeholder. And still working at Pennsylvania Hospital.
Yeah, but you did say that you didn't much like the politics.
I didn't, and then I started to like it even less. I became even more educated about it. It's funny what it does, because while you don't like maybe the raw politics of things, the thought that you really can make change, that you really can do something, kind of just made me more determined that, you need to have power, you need to have position, you need to have allies in order to get things done. So politics almost becomes, a price you have to pay to be able to make that kind of change. Mm-hmm.
So you are on the freeholder board.
I'm on the freeholder board.
For how long?
I stayed on the freeholder board for 3.5 years.
Oh.
I decided not, yes, I came off in 85.
So you stayed for longer than the unexpired
I did.
term.
I went through the next election. This becomes kind of a pattern with me, unfortunately, and Governor Florio. I did stand for election, and we won overwhelmingly. I think we did some good things as freeholder, but when I was on the freeholder board, but by 85, I was determined I was not going to run again. It was just not for me. Mm-hmm. And I didn't run again. They lost that year too. That I decided, I announced like 8 or 9 months before the election that I was not going to run. Mm-hmm. I had one young child by that time, and so I was like, I want to do other things, and so I started doing consulting with Pennsylvania Hospital, mm-hmm. And eventually with some others, and built a consulting firm. And Jim decided not to run in 1985. So things were calm until.
Were you now seen as a Florio acolyte? I mean, I know enough about Camden County politics to know that there was the Florio faction, there was the Ericetti faction, there were a number of different groups. You were clearly allied with the Florio group.
According to the press.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, clearly identified as a Florio person.
Okay.
Yes.
So 85 to 89, Jim's back in Washington, you're back in private life. How did you end up getting back together again?
I was in private life building a business, a consulting business, raising my young children as well, and still involved somewhat in kind of healthcare planning and different things, but not in an official way. But still very interested in what was going on. When Jim decided to run in 1989, I said, this time it's not going to be 6 weeks at the end. I'm going to go on the campaign. And I worked the campaign from West Orange the mm-hmm. whole time.
Did he ask you, or did you volunteer, or was it just a sort of a mutual understanding that as soon as he announced, you would go and work for him?
I don't remember a specific conversation. I think it was probably just a mutual understanding that if he ran, mm-hmm. I would come and work on the campaign.
At this point, did you consider Jim a mentor? Did you consider him a colleague? Did you consider him a friend? Did you consider him all of the above?
All of the above. Uh-huh. All of the above. Jim is an extremely committed person about doing the right thing and about sticking to his ideals. He's determined, hardworking, all those things that I admired a great deal. So the thought of him being in the position where, again, if my goal is to make change, and to improve people's lives and give people opportunity, then, these are the same things that the governor believed, or believed as a congressman, and in running for governor. So I was quite enthusiastic about it.
What role did you play in the campaign?
I was one of the senior advisors in the campaign, so I was in West Orange every day. I oversaw all of his appearances and schedule, set in on all the strategy sessions. James Carville was our consultant, if you remember back then. So that was quite entertaining.
Well, I would imagine that was quite a,
it was
not
quite
only
entertaining,
but informative as well.
It was. He's a very, very bright man, but it was a wonderful experience, that campaign. You know, in terms of people working together, and certainly with the success that we had. So it was a very enjoyable experience.
Did you find yourself drawn into discussions of political strategy and such? And did you warm to that? Did you enjoy doing that kind of planning?
Yes, okay. I enjoy thinking about what needs to be done, you know, what kind of hard work needs to be done, what things need to be touched, how you need to position, you know, on a lot of different. I love strategy, I love execution on strategy and getting to a good result. So it certainly was interesting and very exciting, and lots of very active debates among the campaign staff about, you know, positions to take and where to go and who to see and what to do.
Now, you at this point probably knew Jim Florio better than any of the other senior advisors in the campaign. If you had been working with him since even before 1981, I mean, most of the other key people who were involved in that campaign came to him much later.
Right.
Do you feel as though he relied more heavily upon you in terms of your personal interaction, or in terms of, I don't want to say bearing his soul, but in terms of letting you know more about who he is than he let on to other people? Do you feel as though you know him at a deeper level than most of the other senior people who were involved in his campaign?
That's interesting. I wouldn't be able to speak to how they feel. I think that there were often times when when I could walk into the governor before he was governor and after he was governor and say something that maybe others were not comfortable saying, or didn't understand how to have a conversation with him about a particular issue, or didn't understand why he was taking a certain position on something. And having watched him, you know, be steadfast in his beliefs for so many years, and kind of understanding the evolution of some of those beliefs, probably made me feel closer and be closer to him than maybe some others were.
Would you say you knew where to push when others wouldn't have, or knew when to back off when others might not have? Was that part of the equation?
It could be. I mean, I think sometimes, you know, people who might describe the governor as stubborn, I would say he's steadfast, you know? And there are ways to, you know, kind of approach those things. The bottom line is, if he felt like something was the right thing to do, he wasn't going to compromise. And so you really had to figure out how to go for that. It's not that he would never compromise, but he's not going to start out compromising. So anytime you would present something to Jim and you would say, well, here's what's going on, okay? And he would say, well, what do we need to do? And then you would explain to him the politics of the issue, you know, as well as the policy. And he only wanted to hear the policy. And he would say to you, what's the right thing to do? And so you would say, okay, the right thing to do. Now, those who would answer him with some kind of convoluted connection of politics and policy, you know, the right thing to do being defined as how do you win the politics of it, you know, would have a short conversation with him, because he really wanted to know what's the right thing to do. And once you told him the right thing to do, he said, well, then that's what we're going to do. And that often meant coming out of his office, you know, going, oh, you know, are we ever going to do this? And how are we going to do this and this and this and this and that? Many times, a lot of things going on, if you remember those years at the same time, a lot of major initiatives. So I would say that in the sense of whether thinking he's stubborn or doesn't quite understand the political ramifications of what he might be doing, he understood all of that all the time. He just chose to do whatever he thought the right thing to do was.
There are some folks who've known him for a long time who say that from Valentine's Day 1988 which is the day he and Lucinda got married, he changed. Did you see a perceptible change in his demeanor, in perhaps any softening of the hard edge that a lot of people saw in Jim Florio after his marriage?
It was a wonderful thing to watch. He loved and loves Lucinda very much, and you could see that love from Lucinda. It was a pleasure for many of us who have known and loved the governor for years to watch that. So yes, I did see that. I'm not sure that people who don't know him well noticed the difference, but those of us who knew him well absolutely saw him being happy, not as, maybe certainly as driven, but driven in a happier way, like we're feeling good about where we're going, rather than stressed about getting there.
Yeah, some of us who remember him as a single guy who lived over a liquor store and
in D.C.
Did nothing but work 24 hours a day did notice a difference. And,
yes.
And I think that you've reflected what some of that difference was.
Right.
Okay, so now it's 1989. We're coming to the end of the campaign. Steve Persky comes on board, which is the first sign that everybody thinks, hey, we're actually going to win this thing. And some folks on the campaign staff begin to transition over to the idea of let's start building an administration. At what point did you become involved in that transition?
I had no intention of going into government. Okay, so I was there for the campaign. The governor and I had this conversation to win the campaign, and I was going back to my business. I picked up the New York Times one day, and my picture was there with Doug Berman and Steve Persky, and I don't remember, there were 5 of us, and announcing
probably
that
Carl
I was
Van Horn and
yes,
John Schuer. I would
that's
imagine that would have
probably
been
exactly who it was, announcing that we were the nucleus of the governor's office staff. Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
And at that point, there's no going back, or
no, he's quite tickled by that. By the way, he thought that was cute. He thought that was
funny. Is that because he had told them that that's who the
yes.
nucleus of his staff would be?
Yes.
So wow.
Yes.
And how did you feel about that?
It's funny. I was flabbergasted, obviously, but also very committed, and had put a lot of time, obviously, into the campaign and into Jim Florio. And so I had a conversation with him, and I was like, okay, what is this? And he says, well, there's no way you can't come in and help me get settled. I mean, I don't know what to do, about what are we going to do about all these things we're supposed to do with health care, and you're just going to go back, to Camden County? And I said, okay, that's fair. So I'll come in for 6 months.
How did your family feel about this?
My family was fine with it.
Okay.
I think they probably knew, that
before you did.
Before I did, that I couldn't just walk away from it. But so I said to him, we'll have this deal. I'll come in for 6 months. And, we'll hire the right commissioner of health, we'll hire all the right policy people, we'll do all this, get settled down, and then I'll go back, to my business. And by the way, I'm homeroom mother this year, and I do this and I do that, and I have to do all of these things. Mm-hmm. And he was like, no, that's fine. I said, and my daughter takes ballet classes all the time, and I'm going to have to leave sometime and to do that. My son plays soccer, and he's like, I understand. That's all just fine. It'll be wonderful. Okay.
Sold you a bill of goods.
Yeah, kind of.
And 4 years later,
well, as you know, from the beginning, we did not have an easy day.
No.
Okay, from the beginning, and so he, the governor was determined to do something about clean water, assault rifles. We had and taxes. Of course, we had a big structural budget problem. He also wanted to do something about healthcare, certainly something about education, and then the decision came down on education, and we had to do something. So we never had an easy day from the time we got in, partly because we were so determined, he was so determined, and we on his behalf to get things done, partly because I think we were a bit politically naive in working with the legislature, and for a lot of reasons, we had quite a few battles on our hands
I'll get back to the political naivete in a second, but let's talk a little about the structure of the governor's office as it was set up. And I suppose at this point, in the interest of full disclosure, I should point out that I was on the staff for the first year of the administration. And some of the questions that I'll ask will come from personal experience, and some will come from the general perception of what was going on at the time. You were given the title Chief of Management and Planning. Carl Van Horn had the title of Chief or Director of Policy. In the Byrne administration and the Kane administration preceding the Florio administration, and in succeeding administrations, there has been a Director of Policy and Planning. But in the Florio administration, there was this bifurcation. Let's start with the question of how did you and Carl Van Horn define the differences or the division of labor or responsibility between your two positions?
I think Carl and I both were very interested, both Florio people, very interested in policy. Carl certainly had a lot of depth in education policy. I had a lot of depth in healthcare policy, so we tended to, kind of lead efforts in those different areas. I had additional interests, though, that in terms of working in the governor's office, it had a broader perspective than just policy. It was management of the departments, working with the cabinet, and those kinds of things. So while policy was part of my title, a lot of what I did, in terms of working with the chief of staff and chief counsel and with the governor was not directly policy driven.
But you did clearly have the policy portfolio when it came to healthcare and human services and related issues.
Absolutely.
Those lines. I'll speak from personal experience. One of the difficulties I think that arose from this delineation of responsibilities was that for folks who had portfolios that weren't specifically education or labor or transportation, which were clearly Carl Van Horn's areas, or health or human services, which were clearly yours, I wouldn't say fell through the cracks, but we weren't quite sure where to go.
Right. Right.
So, for example, when the town of Chislehurst came to the Commissioner of Corrections and said, we'd like to volunteer to have a prison. And the Commissioner of Corrections called me and said, what do you think the governor's position would be about citing a prison in Chislehurst? I didn't know who to go to. I didn't know whether to go to you or to go to Carl. And my recollection is that I ended up coming to you because you happened to be in your office that day. And so that portfolio became yours, at least for the moment.
Right.
I'm sure that I wasn't alone in this, and that there were other policy folks running around who were never quite sure where to go or how an issue was to become resolved. How did you deal with those kinds of situations? And didn't you have situations there where you might feel one way, Carl might feel another, Doug Berman, the treasurer, might feel something completely different? And how did you resolve those kinds of not so much interagency, intramural issues that arose?
I think that you'll find that every new administration has those issues. When you're coming in and you're trying to figure out, who do you talk to and where's the office going to be and what do you do first and how do you do these things, you're going to feel your way a little bit, whether it's a national or a state office or even a local office for that matter. So I think we had all of those challenges. I think that we exacerbated our challenges by saying, okay, now we're going to do assault weapons and we're going to do taxes. We've been here 2 weeks and let's get started. And so I don't think that it's unusual for people to be feeling out, what are you going to own in this administration? What are you going to own? How do we work together? What do you care about? How are we going to prioritize these things? I knew very little about education policy. Although, I desperately believe that education, access to quality education is the key in the quality of one's life. That and healthcare. I believe that those define your ability, your opportunities, your ability to take advantage of opportunities, I should say, as you grow up. So Carl clearly had, while in senior staff meetings we would talk about the policy, the court decision, the politics, and all of that. But in terms of just explaining how all of this should work, it was Carl. And I think that Carl would also say that in healthcare, while he certainly had an interest and knowledge in it, I could probably go deeper there than he desired to go, with rate setting and things like that. So I don't remember us, I'm interested to hear you say that others were confused about what to do and who to go to. I don't remember. We were probably too busy to worry about. If someone chose to go to Carl instead of come to me, I probably was like, "That's a good thing."
Oh, I never ever had the sense that you were warring over who wanted more.
Right.
That was never the issue.
Right.
Actually, I'll raise the question from a different perspective, and it wasn't necessarily mine, but there were complaints because auto insurance reform, assault weapons ban, then the Quality Education Act, and so forth, that there were this series of major policy decisions that were being made at the upper reaches of the administration, and that there were a whole bunch of secondary or tertiary issues that were arising at the same time that people, some cabinet officials, some other agency administrators, want to get up to the level of having decisions made, and felt that they couldn't get there because the senior staff was so obsessed with or overwhelmed by a whole set of issues that were deemed to have a higher priority. That too, I think, happens in the early stages of any administration. But you must have felt, as I think others did in the senior staff, that there were other issues that were not being attended to as a consequence of that.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that, as you say, that's true in every administration. The governor's determination on clean water and auto insurance were things that he committed to do during the campaign. Fixing the auto insurance problem, having clean water. I mean, and those are problems that he fixed as we sit here today. He fixed those problems, and so he was determined to do that. You don't worry about, our beaches, you remember, were getting closed all the time because they were so dirty, so much debris was coming up. This is an issue that he had studied and worked on for years in Congress. So when he got here, he was like, I'm going to fix that. I know how to fix it, and we're going to work on that. And the same thing with auto insurance, and then the assault weapons ban. Okay, now, if you recall, during the assault weapons ban debate, the NRA surrounded the State House, and each of us had to have state troopers even walk us from the governor's office to our own offices, which may be 20 or 30 paces from the governor's office, but we had state troopers on us all the time. And outside of the State House were people yelling and screaming with signs, "Take my wife, not my gun," and making all kinds of threats. So we had our hands full, you remember. And so I'm sure that there were many very important things and causes that people cared very much about, or even sometimes routine government business that was not getting the attention at times that people thought that perhaps it needed. But it certainly wasn't for lack of effort, because we were there, well into the night, every weekend for, it feels like the whole 4 years.
I think you were there till midnight just about every 4 years. I think you missed a lot of those ballet lessons.
I never did.
No?
I never missed a game or ballet practice. And as I remember sitting, and the governor remembers this too, sitting in meetings with negotiating bills with the legislature, with Chuck Italian, with Don Seco, with other people in the legislature, and I would leave the meeting because I had to get back, to an event for my kids. Or there was one time, as my son doesn't even remember this, but I remember it vividly. I was room mother, and this is something working moms can relate to, that is scarred in my heart, and my son doesn't remember it. But I was the room mother for the 4th grade class, and they were going on a class trip that day to do strawberry picking or something. I think it was strawberry. And we were in a meeting in the governor's office, and we were negotiating a bill. And I was very much into the discussion and arguing the points back and forth, and I knew I had to go, and I stayed that extra 10 minutes, you know, to do the, you know, argue the last point, and then I stood up and I said, I've got to go. And the governor said, of course, you know, and that was not a problem. We, you know, flew down 295. I got to the school as they were loading the kids onto the bus. And my son was crying because he thought I wasn't going to come, and he thought they were going to leave me. And he, like I said, he doesn't remember that, but I remember that, and I say, why should I shouldn't have stayed there that last 10 minutes, because nothing is as important. I mean, it's all important, but all of us who work so hard, I'd like to think that we thought we were doing something for the good of the people of New Jersey, and I'd like to think that we didn't neglect our families as much as it feels like. You know, I would come home at night and start homework with my kids immediately. I wouldn't come out of my business suit until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, because I just went right into mode with the kids. And it was a funny time, because my kids were 4 and 6 and around that age, and I would be on TV all the time, of course, with different events and on NJN and stuff like that. My kids would literally walk past the TV and say, Mom, can we change the channel? So I mean, they were totally bored with it. The governor would call my house and he'd go, Kevin, may I speak to your mother? Please do not hang up on me. So it was an interesting time. But yeah, we worked really hard. And so, and I think we accomplished a lot of things. And I think a lot of times during that 4 years, you stop to wonder, gosh, you know, this is hard, and are we getting anywhere?
Well, you certainly didn't have those questions for the first 6 months of the administration.
No,
because you got to a lot of places in the first 6 months of the administration. We did. Thereafter, maybe we'll get to this discussion about relations with the legislature.
Right.
But let me approach another issue first before we get there. And that has to do with the relationship between the front office and the cabinet and the administration. One of the complaints, and this is not restricted to the Florio administration, it seems to happen with just about every new administration, is the issue of micromanaging versus autonomy for cabinet officers. There was certainly a sense in the first 6 to 9 months of the administration that most cabinet officials, there may have been 1 or 2 exceptions, but most of the cabinet officers were afraid to do anything before they felt they had the approval from the front office. And again, the front office was so absorbed in this set of lofty policy issues that a lot of the cabinet officials expressed frustration about not being able to get a sense of what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Did the cabinet officials express this frustration to you, and how did you try to deal with it?
We felt the frustration. I'd make no apologies, though, for I think how we tried to handle it. I don't think we were comfortable. I don't think the governor was comfortable saying, "Here's 19 people. Go do whatever you think is best." And, you know, we'll read about it in the Star Ledger tomorrow. Okay, that's kind of not a way to be a leader and to run an administration. And so we hope we chose really good people, and for the most part we did, who are very committed and dealing with important issues. And I think those issues that were fairly routine, or issues where a cabinet member could make a decision and be able to support it, you know, if it kind of mushroomed into something bigger than they expected, I think went on fine. I think there were certain cabinet leaders who, as you say, were either new to the state or new to a lot of things, and said, I don't quite know what to do here, and there was, you know, had to be a little bit more hand-holding there. But I do, yes, we probably were an administration that was probably more interested in being in control of what was going on in the departments and with our cabinet than some.
Was that a reflection of Jim Florio's personality and interest in not the minutia of government, the detail of policy and policy direction, or was it more a sense of the handful of his closest advisors, you included, that you wanted to carry out these instructions from him? Where did this originate?
I think it originates with the governor, but I think if you went through every single one of us and you looked at Doug Berman and Steve Persky and me and whoever else were close to the governor, we're all kind of the same type of person, you know, in terms of wanting to care deeply about the policy, deeply about the details, and want to make those things happen. Intense. We are all a kind of intense people. So, but I would say the governor's probably more intense than the rest of us. Yeah. He might argue that point, but
no, I'm not sure he will. Well, I don't know. We'll have to ask him one of these days.
It would be a close call, probably.
Let's talk about the legislature. There's certainly, I mean, the greatest criticism that arose of the administration after those first 6 months was you did everything too fast. You tried to do too much too soon. You didn't explain it as well as you could have, and the consequences, the political consequences, were horrendous. You had the Hands Across New Jersey people coming and throwing toilet paper through the windows of the State House. I used to joke that up on the second floor, we got enough toilet paper to last us a year from people who were throwing it through the windows on the second story of the State House. But this resulted after the midterm in a veto-proof Republican majority taking over the legislature, and certainly dramatically changed the equation of power in the State House. How did your relationships, now you were dealing with the legislature primarily, or legislative leaders, I assume primarily in terms of healthcare, human services, policy, and so forth. Did your relationship with legislators change as a consequence of this shift that was taking place in public opinion, or do you feel as though you had a pretty solid relationship all the way through?
First of all, I think those criticisms are well earned. We tried to do too much too soon. We had a lot of success, as you say, in the first few months, and you know, we made some mistakes. And I think taking time to better explain, understanding how the messaging is important, and not just because we understood the policy so deeply and where we were going, just assuming we could go there and everybody would follow us, was a mistake.
Were there particular initiatives that you think should have been brought out more slowly?
Well, certainly the tax, you know, the change in the tax status, the laws should have been discussed more. I think although you know, most of us believe that the NRA and other assault weapons supporters were the money behind Hands Across New Jersey, and it was confusing to all of us, and to the governor in particular, who said, you know, changing the way that we do these taxes is going to help the middle class, not hurt them. And why do we have this Hands Across New Jersey who thinks it's going to hurt them? I think the education funding is something that we could have talked more about in terms of where we're going, not just the mechanics of what we're doing, but more how that's transformational in people's lives, how it can make such a difference, and that helps every taxpayer. It helps us on so many levels, you know, in terms of the prison population and the welfare population and literacy, and, you know, in so many different ways. And so I think I think if we had spent some more time trying to say, okay, here's where we're going, how do we get the buy-in and you do the message right so that people can be supportive, because I think generally people would be supportive of those policies if they had a deeper understanding and not just the headlines or the political heat around a particular issue.
The flip side of that is that Jim Florio had a lot of political capital coming out of the election, having won by a fairly substantial margin, carrying with him majorities in both houses of the legislature that felt beholden to him in part for their election. And if you didn't spend that political capital quickly, you were less likely to be able to get a lot of those initiatives through. So that was obviously the balance that went into this.
Absolutely, and if we could look back and say, well, gee, if we had taken our time and tried to sell all of these things, more to the public, and would we have circumvented all of the political unrest and losing the midterms and things like that? And I would say that probably if you said to the governor, would you have rather done the clean water and the assault weapons and the education funding and the auto insurance, or would you have rather won the midterms and the next reelection? I think he would say, I'd rather have done the things that I'm proud of my body of work and have done those things.
When the legislature shifted, well, let's talk a little about healthcare and human services policy. So some of the issues that you dealt with, aside from these major ones that we were talking about, there was a lot going on in terms of healthcare initiatives and human services initiatives. Let's talk a little about some of them. What were the major What were the major policy areas that you were involved in, and what were the major initiatives in those policy areas throughout the 4 years of the administration?
Well, on the healthcare front, I think that it's some of the things that were going on our state level then are not much different than some of the things that are going on now on the state and federal level. It's always been a question of access and affordability. And you had safety net hospitals in the urban areas who were providing a lot of uncompensated care. We needed to find a way to pay for that. We had a mechanism in the state of New Jersey to pay for that. And then a court decision came down and said, you can't do it that way. And so we were scrambling to find a new way to make sure that everybody in New Jersey had access to care without everybody being insured. And as part of that, we developed small individual and small company and individual insurance plans, dealt with community rating. There were several hospitals that probably should have been closed back then, and we worked on that, but it is incredibly, almost impossibly hard to close a hospital, even though it may not be providing the best care and certainly is not able to make payroll.
But wasn't this what the whole, going way back to the early 70s, what the whole certificate of need process was supposed
for
to
a long time,
resolve?
Yeah. Well, it did. In some ways, it certainly, I think, kept hospitals that were failing hospitals open longer because you weren't going to let every hospital do everything. And so that, therefore, it did make hospitals stronger financially, but the weak ones it didn't do much for. And so we talked about merging some of those hospitals. Now, some of that's occurred now, just simply because they hit the wall. But they hit the wall, 15, 20 years later, after a lot of years where we could have spent less money trying to prop up hospitals that weren't viable anymore, and I think provided better care. So when during this time, during the governor's administration, Bill Clinton was elected, and they made their efforts on health care reform, particularly led by Hillary Clinton. And I spent a few weeks in Washington on the presidential transition team, and was able to participate in some of those meetings and some of that effort. And some of the things that we went through here in New Jersey were not dissimilar to what they were going through on the national level. And then even with Obamacare now, and where you can say, finally, we're going to have access, everyone will have access and affordability, but it's a very complicated situation. You still have a lot of controversy going on.
You sure do.
You do, yeah.
Today, look up the headlines in today's paper speaking about what the House Republicans intend to do with so-called Obamacare.
So healthcare is very, very complicated because it's not, in this country, of course, we have access to public highways and public education and a lot of things that taxpayers accept that this is our responsibility. Healthcare is always, for the most part, is privately paid for, with the exception of Medicare and Medicaid. And we know that Medicare is in trouble financially because we've got so many baby boomers, that'll be aging and living longer. All of us, living longer and aging. And we have also Medicaid is bankrupting a lot of states. And Medicaid was a big weight on New Jersey's budget, back in 1990. So the problems have just exacerbated, in terms of health care over the years, and it'll take several years to fix it. I remember when I first got involved in healthcare policy, and it was whatever the doctor said. That was it. They ruled the healthcare world, and they wouldn't share that. And all of a sudden, here come HMOs, who took that power away. And it has been interesting to watch the evolution of how the way the money flows is where the power flows.
Now the doctors will tell you that it's whatever the insurance company
That's
says.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And we don't seem to be any closer to resolving the question of whether healthcare is a right or a privilege in this country.
Exactly. Yeah, it seems to still be that debate. And on human services, many things that we did, but of course, welfare reform that Senator Bryant and I worked on primarily is probably one of my proudest projects, if you will. In terms of that.
Let's talk a little about that. What form did welfare reform take in New Jersey during the Florio administration?
Well, I would think, I know the governor believes this. Senator Bryant was certainly a catalyst for this. I believed it very much that education was the key to breaking poverty, and especially generations of poverty. And as I said before, when you've got the second and third generation of welfare, where no one's seen anyone in their home ever get up and get to work, and start to believe that there is no opportunity for them, then that's an America that the rest of us don't understand. So there's something that we need to do to intervene there. And so if the American taxpayer is going to support people who need help, welfare was always meant as a temporary situation, not a generational thing, then we had to do intervention that said this taxpayer money should go for education, for training, for child care support while you're working, for all of those things that help you to aspire and to achieve a better life. As part of that, we did some controversial things as well. We said, if you have a second child or another child while you're on welfare, we will not increase the check to pay for that child. And that is no different than what any American family does. They find a way, if they expand their family, to get a second job or do something, or everybody has a little less. And so that same kind of responsibility should be with everyone. Certainly the lack of male figures, of fathers in the household, was a significant situation, and we passed several measures dealing with that. And so it was a package of bills that was the first in the country dealing with welfare reform, and it was strong. It was a strong package. It was not just kind of around the edges. There was severe opposition to it. There was severe opposition from people that we weren't used to opposing us, but understandably so. People who, the right to choose people were against us, the right to life people. Every church denomination, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, Lutherans, everybody was opposed to this thing. Well, because over time, people have started to believe that these people simply couldn't take care of themselves. That we as a benevolent society need to take care of them. And I would often say to them, I said, these people who are on welfare, trapped in these cities, in this generation of poverty, often face more challenges by noon every day than you do in a month, okay? And they manage to get through it, okay? And so let's not underestimate their ability, if provided the opportunity and the urging, the shove at the back of the back, to get the education, to get a job, to be able to support their family, to have the pride of being able to support their family, and to have their children even go higher and aspire to do better things. So that welfare became a temporary situation, time limited, and during that time you had to engage in education and training. And people who, well-meaning, who spent a lot of their time and a lot of their organization's time trying to protect the poor, felt that this was an assault on people rather than something where we say, let's intervene and do the right thing instead of just sending people a check. One of the things that Senator Bryant used to find most offensive, and I did too, was the thing that they called Mother's Day. You know, the first day of the month when the welfare check came, the lines were around the corner to the bank and to the grocery store. And, you know, there's something very demoralizing and demeaning about that. And so, you know, we changed that so that welfare checks came out at different times of the month, and they come out with a little card, and you can go in and, you know, in the grocery store it looks like you're handing a credit card. A lot of things that have to do with how you feel about yourself and what you aspire to do as an American citizen, as part of this great country. And so we started to work on that, and it was difficult, but it was truly a labor of love. And Wayne and I both said to the governor, you got to let us, you know, we got to let us stand in front of you a little bit on this and take, you know, some of those arrows. And so we did.
Some viewers and observers would find it a touch ironic that the liberal Democratic Florio administration was being excoriated by the bleeding hearts of the Catholic Church for being too tough on welfare moms.
Well, we were. We were. And having been through 12 years at Catholic school, I was used to nuns being angry at me from time to time. But
for slightly different reasons.
Slightly different reasons, but that was something where we never had a moment's doubt about that this was something that we needed to do. We needed to persevere on this.
One would imagine that Republican legislators would have been supportive of this.
I think that they may have understood it at that time a little better. I think that everybody was nervous about how it looked. You know, it looked like you were being punitive, and it looked like you weren't caring. So I think there were people that were nervous about that. I think the Republican legislators certainly. Many of them, and many Democratic ones, understood what we were talking about, but certainly were worried about the political fallout.
We should point out that this was an era that was, it was difficult to deal with the two parties, particularly in the second half of the administration, but nothing like what the atmosphere is like today in Washington.
That's true.
There were across the aisle discussions, certainly, that took place on a regular basis that were civil between the Democratic administration and the Republican legislature.
That's right.
And I know that the governor, Governor Florio, speaks a lot about how productive he felt the last 2 years were, despite the fact that there was a veto-proof Republican legislature and that on fiscal policy, they were never going to see eye to eye, but there were a number of other issues, some of them in the health and human services areas, where you were able to get things accomplished.
Yes.
And did you find that your relationships with the Republican legislators were cordial and productive during that period?
For the most part, I think they were. I think we had some healthy debates. I think staff to staff, we certainly would. I mean, Amy Mansue, as we talked earlier, can give you chapter and verse of every argument and every debate. But with the elected officials themselves, I often found far more often than not, that they were interested in what should we do here? How do we fix this? And certainly they had pressures on them from different lobbyists. There's an enormous amount of lobby power, if you will, in the healthcare industry, whether it's the insurance companies or the doctors or the hospitals, you know, heavy weights coming in on you from every front. In the case of uncompensated care, in addition to that, the unions, you know, were all over us about that. So a lot of pressure, a lot of people, I think, interested in trying to find the right answers. And, you know, as Amy reminds me, it was a 96-page bill because we put everything in one bill. And so that was, we felt good about that. I think we did make some headway. And some of the things that we did during that time as part of that bill, and then there was another two big bills we passed, are still in place today.
Again, to put it in perspective, a 96-page bill in those days was considered a pretty massive, comprehensive piece of legislation. as
Yes.
opposed to the 1,300 or 1,400 page bills
Exactly.
that Congress is putting together.
It was a massive bill then
was.
here for New Jersey legislature.
Let's talk a little bit about Jim Florio's management style. He came from a completely legislative background into an executive position. He surrounded himself with those people whose pictures appeared on that New York Times article, who must have come from, well, you certainly came from a very different background from Carl Van Horn, who came from a very different background from Doug Berman, who came from a very different background from Steve Persky. You must have come with some very different ideas, with some different approaches to how to deal with issues. How did Jim Florio delegate responsibility among you, and how did he brook dissent among his inner circle? How did you all resolve differences among yourselves? And there must have been some.
Oh, of course. I mean, with the intensity of what we were dealing with. First of all, the governor was always the leader. He was the leader. He knew policy. He knew what he wanted to do. And it was our job to make that happen, you know, to give him whatever additional background he needed to work with the different constituencies, the legislature, and everybody, and try to make those objectives occur. Again, he never ever wavered from do the right thing. Let's get done what we need to get done. We certainly had debates among the staff about when you're dealing with 5 or 6 major initiatives at one time. And if you push on this vote, you know, you might lose something on this vote. So what comes first, and how can we make this work, you know, when we've got so much going on at the same time? I don't remember having any significant disagreements among us in terms of, not that we spent a whole lot of time on the politics. That was for one of the issues we probably should have spent more time. We were all so busy and so determined to do what the governor wanted us to do, and he clearly was the leader.
But excuse me for just a second. How did he make his decisions about where he wanted to go in terms of synthesizing the advice that he was receiving from you? I mean, I assume that he didn't just say, okay, I want to do this, go out and do it. He must have listened to you in terms of what you all wanted to do. How did he synthesize that information and then come to his decision making? We
would have meetings where we would talk about, say, whether it's clean water or assault weapons or whatever. As you remember, during the assault weapons ban, we had a young teenager killed in Teaneck by a policeman, and that caused quite a bit of controversy, you know, and attention on this. And so we would talk about those things. We talk about what's going on, who's upset, what the issues are, what other issues have been raised by that, what information we've learned, and then we would feed all of that information into him as a group, and then he would make the call.
Mm-hmm. When he did make the call, did you ever get a sense that were there certain circumstances where he would say, all right, I'm not ready to make that call, go back and get me more information?
Absolutely.
All right. And when that happened, I guess what I'm trying to get to is, you know, when you hear about different presidents, for example, some will sit and listen to what everybody in the world has to say and then synthesize through it and say, well, okay, I think we should do this, and then wait for the reaction. Others have been forceful and decisive and said very quickly, this is what I want to have happen, now go out and do it. In which...
That was him.
That was him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
in a very general policy sense, or in a very, very specific step-by-step
very
sense?
specific. And for the most part, I mean, he's not a kind of leader that sits back and says, gee, we should do something about assault weapons. Why don't you guys figure it out and let me know? No, he would say, we need to ban this and this and this and this, because this is what happens if you don't do that. For clean water, we need to make sure we've got enforcement. We need an environmental prosecutor. Right. He even would go so far as to say, what is the tactic to get, to enforce the policy after we, get the policy passed legislatively. So very detailed, very much involved in what was going on. Never phoned in one thing one day of his life.
Let's talk about the last month or so in the governor's office. There are some people that I've talked to who said that Jim Florio took his defeat better than the staff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
No question about it.
Were you, what was your reaction? Where were you on election night? How did you feel?
I was there on election night, of course, because I was certainly went out on the campaign, out of the governor's office onto the campaign for the '93 election. So we were, in fact, counting votes in the back room, trying to get the votes out of Camden County, which we couldn't get out, and certain other districts we couldn't get the results. When we got the vote count in from Camden County, we knew we had lost by a hair, but we had lost. It was then time to assemble downstairs to make the concession speech. I remember John Shore saying to me, "It's time to go downstairs," and I said, "I'm not going downstairs." And he says, "You have to go downstairs." And I said, "I'm not going downstairs." And I went into my hotel room and called my husband, and I said, "We lost." And that was it. And I never went downstairs. And John probably told you that story.
No, he didn't. No.
I never went downstairs. I was devastated by him losing. I was not going to stay in government anyway. I had announced that I wasn't going to stay for another term, but I certainly thought he deserved another term and worked very hard for that. So, yes, he was very gracious in his defeat. He never blamed anybody or anything, and so yes, he handled it better than the rest of us did.
Tell us what you've been doing since what happened in the immediate aftermath. What did you do? Now, you had said you were going to go back to private life, but now you have no choice.
Well, I had my consulting firm I had given to my employees before I went into government after the New York Times article. I was like, okay. So I also had a couple of healthcare facilities, two skilled nursing communities facilities that we had built in the late 80s, from 85 to 89. They went into a blind trust when I was in government, so I came back out and got reacquainted with them. Spent 2 years at home a lot during just kind of, breathing after that 4 years, and it was fun to do that. I still had again my businesses and stuff like that, but I was home a lot, and I loved that being there with my kids.
Did you miss going to Trenton every day and dealing with those issues?
You know what? I didn't go back to Trenton probably for 4 years. I never set foot again in Trenton for 4 years, and my daughter had a class trip to Trenton, and I said, okay, well, I've got to go, and I went at that point. But in all the years, I would say I've probably only been back to Trenton 3 or 4 times in all these years. No, I never missed Trenton, not for 1 minute. So, and then I contemplated what I wanted to do after that. A lot of people were talking to me about a lot of things, and ultimately I decided to start a new company called Brandywine Senior Living, and we raised $65 million worth of private equity money, and we started building assisted living communities, and we bought some skilled nursing communities, and we've recapitalized that business a couple of times, and I now have 25 assisted living communities in 5 states, and love what I do every day.
Wow.
Love it. Yeah.
These are assisted living and skilled nursing facilities?
Well, I don't do skilled nursing anymore. I have one community with a small skilled nursing component in Morristown, but they're all assisted living.
These are not continuing care.
No, they're private pay assisted living, rental, basis. We just opened one up, our 25th in Voorhees last Thursday. So it is a way to give senior. I love it because it's a way for seniors to change their lives. They're not sitting at home lonely, because loneliness is the biggest ager there is. Right. So not sitting home alone with their adult children, worrying about did they take their meds, did they eat, and nobody likes to cook every day to eat alone. And so our communities give them their privacy plus a reason to get up every day and have fun things to do, and so it's something I love.
Is this a public corporation or?
No, it's privately held.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're the CEO?
I am.
Well, this is the point at which I usually ask, what should I have asked you that I didn't?
Oh, I think when I reflect on this, you asked me more than I should have answered, probably.
Well, then I guess that's that. Thanks very much, Brenda.
Thank you, Rick. Great seeing you.
You too.